Yes, don't use WhatsApp or Signal to plan the next military incursion, but maybe we shouldn't be planning as many military incursions, and that's what I want to talk about, actually. Hey there, friends, fans, and foes of Dad Saves America. John Popola here, and I thought I would take this Friday to, of course, talk about the scandal that everyone is talking about. The leaking of military planning in the Signal app by basically all of the leadership of the executive branch, aside from President Trump himself. It is a big story. It is a big deal. And below the surface, there's far deeper questions worth asking than simply, did we use the wrong tools for the job?
The latest fallout from the national security breach in the Trump administration, a reporter mistakenly invited to a group chat about an attack on Yemen on a widely available messaging app.
I get a message request to connect with Mike Waltz, who's the national security advisor, or someone who's purporting to be Mike Waltz. Not an unusual thing in Washington. I'm a journalist. I've met him in the past. So I accept it. Nothing happens. I sort of forget about it. And then a couple of days later, I'm added to a group of seemingly very, very high national security officials of the United States. I think that this is a spoof. I think that someone is running a hoax.
Like a disinformation campaign at this point.
Every time I hear disinformation campaign, my back stiffens a little bit, but I think that was a reasonable concern. You could imagine foreign adversaries constructing what Mr. Goldberg was experiencing for the sake of trying to manipulate the U.S. press, but I digress.
The main reason I thought that actually was that it seemed completely absurd to me that the national security leadership of the United States would be meeting on a messaging app to discuss forthcoming military action, and that they would also sort of invite the editor of The Atlantic magazine.
Yeah, of all the guys to invite to this app, he's probably the worst. So there's obviously a mistake. And a pretty terrible one. And I think those who are supporters of the president who've tried to downplay this mistake are themselves in error. I think they're falling prey to partisan politics. This was a blunder. And the responses to it in the immediate aftermath of these stories haven't been particularly good.
Nobody's texting more plans. I know exactly what I'm doing, exactly what we're directing. And I'm really proud of what we accomplished, the successful missions that night and going forward.
I never like when you have to say, I know exactly what I'm doing. Not to dunk on Pete Hegseth. This actually wasn't even his fault. He's not the one that set up this thread, but don't ever say that. Don't say, I know what I'm doing. Just let that be assumed.
There were no sources, methods, locations, or war plans that were shared.
Doubling down in their denials, U.S. intelligence heads insist that details about a strike in Yemen discussed in a Signal chat where reporter Jeffrey Goldberg was present were not classified. And so The Atlantic called their bluff, publishing highly sensitive material detailing what military assets like jets and drones would be used, and crucially, the precise timing of the launches, information that could have put U.S. service members in danger. The administration sees it differently.
I think the American public should decide for themselves based on the outcome of this operation.
The unexpected access, now an embarrassment for the National Security Advisor Mike Waltz.
President Trump's National Security Advisor Mike Waltz saying the blame lies with him.
I take full responsibility. I built the group. Embarrassing, yes.
And I think that's fair, and I think good on him for just straight up saying, I did this. This is my mistake. I'm taking responsibility for it. Does he deserve to be fired for this? I don't know. That's frankly above my pay grade. This is the kind of thing that mistakes can happen, right? We make these kind of mistakes in our own lives. We include somebody that we didn't intend to include. But others have covered how there's supposed to be procedures for this kind of communication that are very tightly controlled to avoid using consumer apps with your own personal address books that might be adding the wrong person by accident. So not a small boo-boo, kind of a big boo-boo. And when you look at what was being talked about, it's not good. It's not good at all.
Fox News alert for you. The Atlantic has now just published brand new messages from the Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth and others from that Signal chat group.
He texted the group at one point, at 2:10, more F-18s launch, second strike package. Then at 2:15, strike drones on target, all caps. This is when the first bombs will definitely drop. Pending earlier trigger-based targets. It goes on to explain.
And by this, it's literally like hours in advance. So this is like a real-time playback of the exact tactics, times, and technologies being used. If this isn't sensitive military planning information, I don't really know what is, but I guess what the hell do I know?
F-18 strikes, and then he says more to follow. He says they were currently clean on OPSEC.
Democrats are seeking accountability as probes deepen about how many of these text chains exist or existed on a chat platform only approved for non-classified material.
This is just a mess, and it's just a bad look. It's a mistake. And plenty of other people are going to talk about what a disaster, and they're going to beat up the Trump administration for being incompetent, and Pete Hegseth's a drunk, and blah, 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 blah. That's your usual talking points. I think that's all real boring. I think what's much more important to think about is, why are these operations happening? Yes, don't use WhatsApp or Signal to plan the next military incursion, but maybe we shouldn't be planning as many military incursions. And that's what I want to talk about, actually. But first, let's hear from President Trump about why this was happening in the first place.
Do you still believe nothing classified was shared?
Well, that's what I've heard. I don't know. I'm not sure. You'll have to ask the various people involved. I really don't know. I can only tell you this. You don't want to talk about it. The Houthis have been horrible to the world. What they've done, killed a lot of people and knocked down a lot of ships and planes and anything else. It's not just the ships. And they have been hit harder than they've ever been hit. And they want us to stop so badly. And they've got to stop. They've got to say no mas.
I don't think they're going to say no mas because they don't speak Spanish in Yemen. That might be like a holdover from a prior conversation about Venezuelans or something, but it's not actually a laughing matter. It's a serious matter along 100 dimensions. So if you aren't familiar with what's going on in Yemen, in the Red Sea, and why it matters, why it could be at least arguably construed as in American interest and global interest, well, let's take a look.
This strait is called the Bab el-Mandab, meaning the Gate of Tears.
Off to a bad start. The Gate of Tears. The Gate of Tears, indeed.
Vessels have to go through the passage to get to the Suez Canal, which handles about 12% of world trade and is a major maritime choke point. But this is also one of the most dangerous shipping areas on the globe. In the months following the Hamas-Israel war, a commercial ship was hijacked here, another was targeted by a drone here, and these circles represent other attacks by militants on boats in the strategic zone. Avoiding it means adding thousands of nautical miles by traveling around the Cape at the bottom of Africa, an expensive and time-consuming venture. Instead, some vessels are looking to bolster security to avoid disruption in the Red Sea and mitigate against delays that could see consumer prices rise. Here's how.
And this footage right here is pretty crazy. This is actually from the Houthi Media Center. Body cam footage, it looks like it's straight out of Call of Duty, but these are actually Houthi rebels boarding a ship.
Recent attacks on commercial vessels in the key waterway have been launched by the Houthis, an Iran-backed militant group in Yemen.
An Iran-backed military group. I'm going to come back to the history of the Houthis because that is a shorthand, but it is a lot more complicated than that.
The Houthis are using positions next to the Bab el-Mandab to target merchant vessels, in what it says is a response to the Hamas-Israel war. This bodycam footage shows the moment armed militants land a helicopter on the deck of a cargo ship before storming into the bridge. The vessel was traveling on the Red Sea, a vital passage for shipping goods through the Suez Canal from Asia into Europe to the rest of the world. It's the first time that merchant vessels have been targeted by anti-ship ballistic missiles, according to US officials.
And you may remember that this is the same area where Somali pirates had attacked vessels for years ago. But nothing like this level of sort of military sophistication.
Shipping companies are also turning to security analysts for advice on dealing with another new threat, drone attacks.
This is a revolution in the nature of war that played out in Ukraine and is now at play in the Red Sea as well. One possible measure is learning how to spot drones as they're incoming early so that a ship could then sail to a safe location.
And I got to say, and again, I'm not some military strategy wizard, but the emergence of these very small drones is fundamentally transforming everything, because you can cause a lot of havoc for not a lot of money. And one of the things that's been happening for the past couple of years is that the United States military has been using multi-million-dollar missiles to knock down multi-thousand-dollar drones. And you can see the incentives there. Oh, every missile an adversary puts up is basically draining our bank account for millions of dollars while only hitting theirs for thousands. This is just one of the things that is changing warfare on the planet really profoundly, and it's been accelerated by the war in Ukraine.
But for now, one of the safest ways for vessels to travel through the waterway is to lean on help from allied militaries.
Meaning America. Team America World Police.
A US-led multinational task force moved to the area in December to escort vessels and shoot down projectiles. However, attacks continued. The US is looking at different options to try and end the trouble in the waterway.
One is a more forceful military response, measures that could take out the Houthis' military capabilities at their route.
And let me just say, this video is actually from a year ago. So this has been going on for years. In fact, it goes back to the Obama administration and beyond, the conflict with the Houthis and Yemen. But this idea of actually striking the targets on land, essentially getting into serious military conflict and hostilities, this is part of what's new.
A lot of people say that ultimately the best way to stop this becoming a crisis is to pursue diplomacy.
Saudi Arabia, a key US partner in the Middle East, for example, is in talks with the Houthis about ending the civil war in Yemen, halting attacks in the Red Sea, and in turn helping the world continue with global trade could be another item on the agenda during those negotiations.
How should we think about what this is? It's not like we're simply throwing bombs around for no reason. This is a serious issue. It is a serious issue for global trade. And in fact, Houthi missiles have hit military targets for several years. We have had US warships being hit by these Houthi rebels directly. This whole thing actually reminded me of something that I didn't know all that much about, and that is the attack by the Barbary pirates during Thomas Jefferson's presidency. So this is these kind of problems have been going on for a long time. In fact, the Marines sing about this in their hymn.
From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, we find our country's battles in the air, on land and sea.
And with drones, and with cyber warfare. Tripoli, that was the Barbary pirates. So just as a quick trip down American history, what was that all about?
Immediately after the Revolutionary War, the U.S. lost the protection of the naval forces of Britain and France in the Mediterranean. And the Barbary pirates were the naval forces of the satellite states of the Ottoman Empire, who essentially demanded tribute or would seize commercial vessels and hold as prisoners and hostages their crews, and sometimes even put them into slavery.
And this is a little side note that slavery was really something these guys loved. In fact, the word slave comes from Slavic peoples, who the Arabs of this area were enslaving en masse. So for those of you with kids getting social studies classes that talk about America's great sins during 1619, they use this opportunity to maybe reintroduce them to the origins of slavery, which go way farther back and to this day have been more stridently practiced elsewhere, like in the Middle East.
When the issue came up in Jefferson's time, Jefferson did explicitly authorize the naval forces that Congress had provided him to defend American commerce. And if they saw a Tripolitan Barbary pirate ship coming out to attack a U.S. commercial vessel, they were given instructions to go ahead and prevent that attack and to attack those vessels. He did not inform Congress of those specific instructions.
Sounds pretty similar, right? You have foreign vessels, merchant trade happening in the Middle East through those seas, through the Red Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. Foreign pirates trying to take us out, and a U.S. president, without declaring war, taking it back to him. These were considered fundamentally defensive actions. This was meant to be defending the ships against actual aggressive attack. And I think that's one area where what has been done this month and in the past few weeks is different. We are not merely running our warships alongside commercial vessels and deflecting attack. We have now gone on the offense to hit the Houthis in Yemen. I am more skeptical in general of U.S. foreign adventures. And I get it honestly from several people, one of whom is a former congressman from Michigan, Justin Amash. He's been on a tear on Twitter talking about this and from a principled place. And I think he lays some foundation for argument. Because the question is, does the president even have the authority to do what he's doing, to actually launch military actions of this sort, not merely to be defensive, but to retaliate and to hit targets on another country's soil? So let me give you a tiny bit of background here. Article 1 of the Constitution sets forth that the U.S. Congress must declare war and actually really controls a lot of the mechanisms of how that would go about in terms of the setting up of the Navy and the funding of all of these things. It is the president that's the commander-in-chief, but the president does need to seek acts of Congress in order to engage in hostilities. That has been refined by a law called the War Powers Resolution, which was passed in the 1970s to try to basically respond to the Vietnam War and to further constrain and define the role that the president has. And so something most people forget is that we as a country have not declared war since World War II. Every military action, North Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen, all matter of stuff. This has all been done without a formal declaration of war. Many of these things we call wars, right? Like the Iraq War and the War on Terror, which is its own sort of strange thing, war on an idea. But this is the new world order of war in the United States. And it's not just here in the U.S. It's beyond the U.S. Declarations of war have become increasingly rare. But as a matter of law and what our constitutional republic is supposed to do and constrain, the president has limited powers, as does the Congress. We have enumerated powers designed to limit the executive, legislative, and judicial branches so that we don't end up in tyranny. And the abuse of military power is probably worry number one for the descent into tyranny. So with that backdrop, the arguments being made right now for why the president feels he can do this and why the military and the Department of Defense believes they can simply say, fire off a bunch of rockets and launch a bunch of aircraft and bomb targets in this foreign country that we're not technically at war with. And because basically Saudi Arabia is our buddy, they are relying on what's known as a AUMF, an authorization for the use of military force. And specifically, they're relying on the 2001 authorization that was put forward with regards to the aftermath of 9/11. And as former Congressman Amash points out, that authorization for force, for the use of military force, was very specific to be used against those nations, organizations, or persons he determines, he being the president, planned, authorized, committed, or aided the terrorist attacks that occurred on September 11th, 2001, or harbored such organizations or persons. That is the fundamental basis being used for launching kinetic military actions against the Houthis. I don't think the Houthis had anything to do with 9/11. I don't see how that's justifiable. I don't see how the president doesn't need to go back to Congress and say, look at what's going on here. We got Barbary Pirates 2.0. Please authorize my ability to use military force in Yemen for X, Y, and Z purposes. That's my reading, as is Justin Amash's and others, for what the president should be doing. The fact that the Signal stuff got leaked and that they're using the private encrypted app, that's not a good look. It's even worse a look when you think about how much hay was made of Hillary Clinton using private email servers. But it's a sideshow compared to the bigger problem that we all thought, I think, President Trump was more inclined to be skeptical about. The other piece of the puzzle here, and this is one that the leaked communications lays bare, is the idea that within the War Powers Act, there is a provision for the president to take unilateral action, that is, action without approval by Congress, if there is an immediate, imminent threat to the U.S. or its properties. But what you see in these threads is something very different. You see conscious planning for an attack that was explicitly said to be not urgent or even especially timely. It could happen a month from now. So the fundamental premise that this is an authorized action is I think, arguable at best, simply a violation of statute and the law at worst. And I think it is the latter. This brings me to a moment that I want to revisit. It had a big impact on me, and if you haven't seen this, it's worth revisiting. This is a debate moment from the 2008 election where then Congressman Ron Paul talking about our involvement overseas and what it does. This was a seminal moment for me, and I think for a lot of people who've come to be skeptical of U.S. military adventures overseas.
Well, I think the party has lost its way because the conservative wing of the Republican Party always advocated a non-interventionist foreign policy. Senator Robert Taft didn't want to be in NATO. George Bush won the election in year 2000 campaigning on a humble foreign policy, no nation building, no policing of the world.
And just as a quick reminder, for those of you who are too young to know about this, President Bush, George W. Bush, did in fact campaign on a humble foreign policy. And it was in direct response to the Clinton administration's foreign adventures in places like Kosovo and the Middle East.
There's a strong tradition of being anti-war in the Republican Party. It is the constitutional position. It is the advice of the founders to follow a non-interventionist foreign policy. Stay out of entangling alliances. Be friends with countries. Negotiate and talk with them and trade with them. And my argument is that we shouldn't go to war so carelessly. When we do, the wars don't end.
Congressman, you don't think that changed with the 9/11 attack, sir?
What changed?
The non-interventionist policies.
No, non-intervention was a major contributing factor. Have you ever read about the reasons they attacked us? They attack us because we've been over there. We've been bombing Iraq for 10 years. We've been in the Middle East. I think Reagan was right. We don't understand the irrationality of Middle Eastern politics.
This made a lot of people's hair stand up on the back of their head. It sounded like a justification for 9/11, for Osama bin Laden, but it was also straight out of the reports that would subsequently come from our government about the origins of the 9/11 attacks. Two things can be true at the same time. Osama bin Laden can be a really bad guy who did awful things, and some of his criticisms may have not been entirely off the mark.
What would we say here if China was doing this in our country or in the Gulf of Mexico? We would be objecting. We need to look at what we do from the perspective of what would happen if somebody else did it to us.
Are you suggesting we invited the 9/11 attack, sir?
I'm suggesting that we listen to the people who attacked us and the reason they did it. And they are delighted that we're over there because Osama bin Laden has said, I am glad you're over on our sand because we can target you so much easier. They have already now, since that time, have killed 3,400 of our men, and I don't think it was necessary.
Wendell, may I make a comment on that? That's really an extraordinary statement. That's an extraordinary statement of someone who lived through the attack of September 11, that we invited the attack because we were attacking Iraq. I don't think I've ever heard that before, and I've heard some pretty absurd explanations for September 11.
Now, I understand the clapping. I was in New York during 9/11. I was living there at the time. And it was a big deal. But years later, I was in a different place, and I think a lot of us were, and I think Ron Paul was more clear-eyed on this than Rudy Giuliani.
And I would ask the congressman to withdraw that comment and tell us that he didn't really mean that.
Congressman?
I believe very sincerely that the CIA is correct when they teach and talk about blowback. That if we think that we can do what we want around the world and not incite hatred, then we have a problem. They don't come here to attack us because we're rich and we're free. They come and they attack us because we're over there. I mean, what would we think if we were if other foreign countries were doing that to us?
This is a major fault line. And frankly, it has been an area where the parties have truly reverted back to their earlier form. President Trump now gets, or has over the past several years, gotten applause lines for saying the things that Ron Paul was saying back in 2008. And this attack on the Houthis, even if it is perhaps justified on the basis of retaliation for attacks against our ships and shipping, the way it is going about is at odds with that. And in the Signal thread, Vice President Vance says as much. He voices skepticism and pushback about the plan and says it's at odds with the president's broader message about foreign policy, and as well as about bailing out Europe. One thing you will see in the thread, and we will put a link to all of this stuff over at dadsavesamerica.com so you can read the full thread in case you don't have a subscription to The Atlantic. But there is disagreement here, and Vice President Vance, frankly, comes out looking pretty sober on it. Although, bashing of Europe, in addition, frankly. I wanted to take a little time in this video to share some background on the Houthis, not because you should care that much about the Houthis. You probably shouldn't. We're here in America, we've got busy lives to lead, but since this is at the center of our discourse at the moment, I think it's important to see just how crazy things are, just how entangled things have been, and just how wise I think Ron Paul's warnings were with regard to being involved over there and having it blow back onto us years and years and years later. One more thing. This video has some disturbing images of some of the children who have suffered through starvation as a result of the blockades and the various things that have happened in this mostly ignored disaster in Yemen. So with that warning, let's dig in.
Since 2015, a Saudi-led coalition has been waging a war against the Houthi rebels in Yemen, unleashing one of the most severe humanitarian crises in recent history. But who are the Houthis? The Houthis make up around 25% of Yemen's population. Although they belong to the Shia sect of Islam, they are Zaydis. They follow a branch that's different to the Twelver Shia Islam, the dominant practice in Iran, Iraq, and Lebanon. Zaydis take their name from Zayd ibn Ali, the great-grandson of Ali who was killed in an uprising. Zayd is revered as a leader that fought against a corrupt regime. The Zaydi believe that it is their religious duty to fight against unjust rulers. That contrasts with most Sunni and Shia doctrines that usually encourage unity over disorder.
Are you already getting a little sense that what are we doing with this? Why are we involved in any of that? What's that got to do with us? Because I am.
For 1,000 years, Zaydis have lived in the mountains of former northern Yemen in what is present-day Saada province bordering Saudi Arabia. In 1978, Ali Abdullah Saleh, a Zaydi, came to power in former North Yemen. 12 years later, North Yemen and South Yemen were united into one country. Saleh's rule lasted until 2011. In the late 80s, Saudi-funded Salafi institutes were established in the north of Yemen with state support. This made Zaydis feel marginalized. They responded by trying to revive their religion and culture under the leadership of Hussein Badruddin al-Houthi, and the Houthi movement was born.
Again, complex stuff. Doesn't have anything to do with the United States of America so far, with one exception, and that is that we have always been in alliance with the Saudis. For 75 years, Saudi Arabia has been our ally. And it is worth noting that of the 19 hijackers on 9/11, 15 were Saudi.
But it was the 2003 war in Iraq that made the group more politically active. The Houthis opposed the US-led invasion of Iraq. Hussein al-Houthi began criticizing Saleh, calling him a US-backed dictator. When some Houthis protested in mosques in the capital Sana'a, Saleh tried to crack down on the movement by sending troops to arrest Hussein al-Houthi. This triggered the first armed conflict between the government and the Houthis. Hussein al-Houthi was killed in 2004, and his brother, Abdul Malik al-Houthi, took over. Saudi Arabia backed the government, and despite religious differences, Iran began supporting the Houthis. The Houthi movement accepted Iran's support, but resisted direct interference. For the Iranians, the Houthis being a counterforce to Saudi interests was enough.
And a counter to Saudi interests is seen in that part of the world as also a counter to US interests, and they're not wrong.
The Houthis achieved initial military success, which provoked more Saudi-backed government force.
With US weapons and US money.
The parties then reached a ceasefire agreement in 2010. A year later, when the Arab Spring reached Yemen, the Houthis were one of many groups calling for Saleh to step down. And when he did, the Houthis joined a national dialogue. But they were unhappy with the outcome, as it would reduce their territorial autonomy. The new president, Abdurrabbu Mansur Hadi, also backed by the Saudis, had trouble stabilizing the country. He couldn't stop al-Qaeda attacks, and fuel prices and unemployment began to skyrocket. This provoked a new rebellion. This time the Houthis allied with their once sworn enemy, former President Saleh.
If you're getting confused, that's okay. But there's a lot of moving chairs, musical chairs. Former dictator, we hate him. No, now he's our ally, but just you wait. He'll be hated before he's killed.
By 2015, Houthi rebels had toppled the government and gained control of Yemen's major cities. When they entered Sana'a, they rebranded themselves as Ansar Allah, or the Helpers of God, and opened air traffic between Tehran and Yemen, promising cheap oil. Across the northern border, Saudi Arabia's king Salman bin Abdulaziz ascended the throne and saw the Houthis as a dangerous and an important pawn in the proxy war against Iran. Saudi Arabia formed a coalition with other Arab states backed by the US, UK, and France and began strikes on the Houthis.
This bombing of Yemen began in earnest by the United States under Barack Obama.
3 years later, the Houthis still control large parts of the country, and the war has been costly. More than 10,000 people have been killed, and almost 2 million children under the age of 5 are considered acutely malnourished.
Maybe we shouldn't have been bombing the heck out of them. Maybe they wouldn't be going after our warships if we hadn't been bombing the heck out of them. You know, on behalf of their neighbor, Saudi Arabia, who also has historically run extremist Wahhabi camps, and 15 of whom flew planes into our towers on 9/11. I mean, you see where Ron Paul's sense of the entanglements and the blowback, this is the CIA term, blowback, takes place. It's worth reminding all of you and myself that we backed the Mujahideen in our proxy wars with the Soviet Union. We played both sides of Iran versus Iraq, and the installing of the Ayatollah and the Islamic Revolution in Iran is at least partly a result, not fully, but partly a result of our meddling over there. So we need to find a way to disentangle from all of this stuff. We really do. It is complicated. But what I'm saying is founded in our founding, because upon exit, George Washington himself, our first president, had this to say, and I think it is prophetic. The great rule of conduct for us in regard to foreign nations is in extending our commercial relations to have with them as little political connection as possible. So far as we have already formed engagements, let them be fulfilled with perfect good faith. Here, let us stop. So President Washington was like, look, let's get out of the foreign entanglements business. And I think the existing ones was probably mostly France for helping with the war. Why forego the advantages of so peculiar a situation? And by this he meant the fact that we were now separated by an ocean from Europe and all of its squabbles. Why quit our own stand upon foreign ground? Why, by interweaving our destiny with that of any part of Europe, entangle our peace and prosperity in the toils of European ambition, rivalship, interest, humor, or caprice? He sounds a lot like Vice President Vance there, doesn't he? He's like, I don't want to be involved in Europe. Let's get out of here. 'Tis our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliances. We're looking at you, Saudi Arabia, with any portion of the foreign world. So far, I mean, as we are now at liberty to do it. For let me not be understood as capable of patronizing infidelity to existing engagements. I hold the maxim no less applicable to public than to private affairs, that honesty is always the best policy. I repeat it, therefore. Let those engagements be observed in their genuine sense, but in my opinion, it is unnecessary and would be unwise to extend them. And let me tell you something. Extend them we sure have. As we sit here, there is something like 750 military bases in 80 countries all around this planet, doing things like keeping global trade alive and much less savory things along the way. All in the name of U.S. interest, all probably defensible by somebody, but all shocking and horrific to our founding fathers. And for that, we pay a great cost. The United States spends more on defense than the next 9 nations combined. That includes China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and the Venezuelans, the Cubans, and everyone else that we think might want to do us harm. Never for good reason, but maybe for some provocation. So I think it's time for us to rethink all that and to look at what's going on with clearer eyes. And just a quick reminder, we're putting all of my research materials over at dadsavesamerica.com in a post with links and embedded videos to all this stuff that I was reading to try to understand what's going on. So head over there, and if you love what we're doing, please subscribe. You can even become a paid subscriber, and there'll be benefits to come with that, as well as helping to keep this show ad-free. And of course, I know you'll let me know what you think in the comments below. I hope you have a great weekend.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together.